Imagine waking up in a colonial town. At first glance, it looks peaceful wooden cottages, dirt streets, a church bell echoing across the settlement. But within the first few hours, you'd already realize something horrifying. You're not in a charming little village. You're in one of the deadliest environments in human history. And you won't last 24 hours. Let's start with the morning. You open your eyes inside a house that smells of smoke, sweat, and rot. Colonial homes were cozy log cabins. They were cramped, dark, and dangerous. The walls leaked in the rain. The windows were just holes covered with oiled paper, and the air inside was thick with ash from a constantly burning fire. That fire was the only source of warmth, cooking, and light. But it was also the #1 cause of house fires, and many families died in their sleep when their homes went up in flames overnight. If you think you'll get a fresh glass of water to wash down breakfast, forget it. Colonial water was almost always contaminated. Wells and streams were polluted with animal waste, human waste, and rotting garbage because sanitation barely existed. Most people drank weak beer, cider, or watered-down alcohol instead, not because they wanted to party at 7 on, but because it was safer than water. If you drank straight from a stream, there's a good chance you'd be vomiting, bleeding, or dead within days from dysentery or cholera. Now let's talk about breakfast. Forget bacon and eggs. On most mornings, you'd be lucky to get a bowl of cornmeal mush or stale bread. Meat was rare, unless you were wealthy. And when you did get meat, it was often spoiled. Colonial people had no refrigerators. They preserved food with salt, smoking, or burying it in the ground. But that didn't stop contamination. Eating breakfast could easily mean eating parasites, mold, or meat crawling with maggots. One wrong bite and you'd spend your 24 hours doubled over with food poisoning. But food and drink weren't your only problems. Disease was everywhere. Colonial America was a breeding ground for smallpox, typhoid, malaria, and plague. Families crammed 10 or more people into tiny houses, sleeping on straw mattresses that doubled as nests for lice and fleas. Every scratch on your skin could turn septic. Every cough could be the start of tuberculosis. If you lived in a coastal town, the stench of the harbor raw sewage dumped directly into the water was strong enough to make visitors gag. For locals, it was just the smell of home. And remember, there were no antibiotics. If you caught something, you prayed or you died. Colonial doctors didn't really heal. They tortured. If you woke up sick in the morning, you might be treated with bloodletting, leeches, or purging methods that drained your strength faster than the disease itself. George Washington himself died in 1799 after being bled nearly to death by his own doctors. If the first president of the United States couldn't survive colonial medicine, you definitely wouldn't. The dangers weren't just medical. Colonial society itself could kill you. These towns were built on harsh laws, strict hierarchies, and brutal punishments. Maybe you overslept and skipped church? That could land you in the stocks, your head, and arms locked into wooden boards in the town square, while people spit at you or threw garbage. Gossip too much? You might be fitted with an iron scold's bridle, a cage that locked around your head with a spike pressed into your tongue. Forget freedom of speech. Just saying the wrong thing about the local leaders or church could mean a whipping, a fine, or worse. Now imagine you're not from the right background. Maybe you're a poor laborer, an indentured servant, or worse, a slave. Your morning doesn't start with breakfast. It starts with back-breaking labor in the fields from sunrise to sunset, with the constant threat of beatings if you falter. In towns across New England and the South, entire communities were built on human suffering. For enslaved Africans, there was no such thing as survival within 24 hours. It was a lifetime sentence of brutality. Even if you were free, you weren't safe. Native raids were a constant fear on the frontier. Colonial towns were often built on stolen land, and conflicts erupted into bloody violence. Waking up in the morning might mean hearing war cries in the distance, or finding out that your neighbors had been killed during the night. Fear was constant, and survival was never guaranteed. And if you were a woman in a colonial town, the morning was even deadlier. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. With no trained doctors, no sterilization, and no pain relief, every birth was a gamble. Midwives used crude tools and folk remedies that sometimes killed both mother and child. If you happened to go into labor during your 24 hours, your chances of survival were slim. Let's put this into perspective with a real story. During the winter of 1609 in Jamestown, Virginia, known as the Starving Time, colonists were so desperate for food that they ate rats, dogs, and even human corpses. Archaeologists have found the remains of cannibalized settlers, including a 14-year-old girl. Imagine waking up in that world. By morning, you're already hungry. By noon, you're considering eating your leather shoes. By nightfall, someone else might be considering eating you. This wasn't rare. Starvation, disease, and violence were baked into everyday life in early America. Colonial towns weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival, and most people didn't survive. So by the end of the morning, let's take stock. You've woken up in a fire trap of a house, surrounded by smoke and lice. You've eaten spoiled food, nothing at all. You've drunk contaminated water or weak beer that makes you dizzy. You've watched people punished brutally in the town square, and you're already coughing from the diseases that float invisibly through the crowded streets. You've only been in this colonial town for a few hours, but your chances of surviving the full 24? Almost zero, because the morning was just the beginning. The real dangers are still waiting in the afternoon. The morning was brutal, but as the day drags on, the afternoon is when a colonial town truly shows its teeth. You've survived spoiled food, choking smoke, and the ever-present risk of disease. But now comes the work, the endless back-breaking labor that defined colonial life. And for you, this might be the moment when survival finally slips away. The sun rises high above the town, and it is merciless. Colonial America had no concept of sunscreen, no lightweight fabrics to keep cool. Men and women worked in heavy wool, coarse linen, or rough leather. The heat trapped inside those clothes was unbearable, but stripping down wasn't an option. Modesty was demanded by both law and religion. A little skin showing could earn you a public shaming or worse. So instead, you bake alive while trudging through the afternoon's work. For most colonists, that work meant farming. Agriculture wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival. Families planted corn, wheat, or tobacco, depending on the region, but farming was hard labor from dawn till dusk. And here's the kicker: most of them barely produced enough to survive. Tools were primitive, crops often failed, and the soil was unpredictable. A single bad season could mean starvation for the entire town. Imagine it. You're sweating under the noon sun, hacking away at stubborn ground with a crude iron hoe. Your body covered in bug bites. Mosquitoes swarm around you, carrying malaria and yellow fever. Every sip of water you take might be crawling with bacteria. You're already weak from hunger, and now your muscles are screaming, your skin blistering, and your lungs gasping for air filled with dust and pollen. But this is only if you're lucky enough to be free. If you're an indentured servant or enslaved, your afternoon is far darker. Servants were bound to years of unpaid labor, often tricked into signing contracts they couldn't escape. They worked until they collapsed, beaten if they slowed down. Enslaved Africans, brought against their will, faced even worse. For them, the afternoon sun was not just brutal, it was deadly. The afternoon nearly broke you. You've endured hunger, heat, labor, and punishment. But now, as the sun sets, you face the most dangerous part of all nightfall in a colonial town. Darkness in the 1600s and 1700s wasn't like today. There were no streetlights, no electricity, no safe glow of neon signs or headlights. When the sun went down, the town was swallowed in blackness. A single candle or a weak oil lamp was all that stood between you and total darkness. And that darkness was alive with danger. Let's start inside the house. The fire that warmed you in the morning now flickers threateningly. A single spark could catch the dry wooden walls, and by the time you noticed, your home could be a roaring inferno. Families slept in fear, knowing that a single ember could mean death by fire or suffocation. But fire wasn't the only nighttime terror. Rats swarmed the towns, especially at night. They crawled into pantries, chewed through sacks of grain, and carried fleas infected with plague. Lice and bedbugs infested the straw mattresses. You'd lie down to sleep, only to feel the itch of bites across your body, or the crawl of something living in your hair. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a battlefield against vermin. And then there was the cold. Colonial houses weren't insulated. Winters were brutal, and many nights, families huddled together under thin blankets, teeth chattering, praying not to freeze before morning. In places like New England, temperatures often dropped below zero. Children froze to death in their sleep. If the cold didn't kill you, the damp air could, creeping into your lungs and feeding the pneumonia that claimed countless lives. Outside, the dangers multiplied. Nighttime was when crime came alive. Colonial towns were not the safe, orderly places history books sometimes describe. Thieves prowled the streets, looking for unlocked doors or drunken victims stumbling home. Violence was common. A mugging could leave you bleeding in the mud, and with no hospitals, that wound could fester and kill you days later. But the worst threat at night wasn't criminals. It was fear itself. Superstition ruled the colonial mind. Witches, ghosts, demons, and spirits were thought to walk the earth after dark. Every creak of wood, every howl of the wind was a potential omen. Ministers stoked that fear with sermons of damnation, warning that Satan himself was always near. In towns like Salem, those fears turned deadly, leading to accusations, trials, and executions. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that if your neighbor had a bad dream about you, it could mean your death by morning. And let's not forget the wilderness beyond the town walls. Colonists lived surrounded by deep forests, vast rivers, and unknown dangers. At night, those woods echoed with the cries of wolves, coyotes, and owls. For settlers, these sounds weren't just eerie. They were terrifying reminders that nature itself was always pressing in. Many towns feared raids from native tribes, whose land they had stolen. A night attack could leave entire settlements wiped out in a storm of fire and blood. Whether real or imagined, the threat was constant. Now picture this. It's midnight. You're lying on a straw mattress, your stomach empty, your skin itching from lice, your body aching from labor. Outside, dogs bark wildly. Maybe it's a thief. Maybe it's a wolf. Maybe it's nothing. But your heart races because you know that in a colonial town, danger is always real. If you were sick during the day, the night was even worse. Fevers spiked after sunset, leaving people delirious and sweating in the dark. Families gathered around the sick, whispering prayers, while outside, the town minister prepared for another burial. Death often came at night, and families woke to find their loved ones cold and lifeless beside them. But even if you somehow survived disease, cold, vermin, and fear, the night still had one last cruelty: childbirth. For women, labor often struck at night. Imagine going into labor in the dark, with only a candle flickering in the corner. A midwife might arrive if you were lucky, but there were no sterile tools, no anesthesia, no understanding of infection. The cries of women in childbirth filled the nights of colonial towns, and far too often, those cries ended in silence. By now, you've lived nearly 24 hours in a colonial town. You've faced starvation, disease, labor, punishment, superstition, and violence. Your body is weak, your mind is broken, and your chances of seeing another sunrise are slim. Because here's the truth. Colonial life was designed for survival, but most people didn't survive. The average life expectancy was shockingly low. Children died by the dozens. Women died in childbirth. Men died from accidents, infections, or war. Whole families vanished in epidemics. And even for those who survived, life was constant suffering. Every day was a gamble. Every night was a battle. To live in a colonial town wasn't to thrive. It was simply to endure. So when you ask, why wouldn't I survive 24 hours in a colonial town? The answer is simple. Because colonial towns weren't built for you to survive. They were built on hunger, fear, punishment, and death. And even the people who lived there often didn't make it past their first 24 hours.